Hey everyone, I'm Cash Blob, your friendly finance guru with a classy top hat, and I've got a big question today. Can a country just cancel its debt? Governments owe trillions in debt. For example, the US national debt is over $35 trillion. It's tempting to imagine a country waving a magic wand and poof, debt gone. But is wiping the slate clean that simple? Or does it come with a catch? We're going to explore what national debt really is, why countries borrow money, and what would actually happen if a country just said, no more debt. Along the way, we'll see some real-world examples, like Argentina, Greece, Zimbabwe, and Russia, and find out why defaulting, a fancy word for refusing to pay debt, is kind of like burning down your house to kill a spider. Finally, we'll look at smarter alternatives to deal with big debt, restructuring, inflation, growing the economy, and wrap up with a memorable takeaway. Let's dive in. But what is national debt? Before we talk about canceling debt, let's understand what national debt is. Simply put, national debt, also called sovereign or government debt, is the total amount of money a government has borrowed and not yet paid back. Governments borrow money to cover budget deficits when spending exceeds tax revenues, to fund big projects, or to respond to crises. Over time, these yearly deficits pile up into an overall debt balance. Think of it like a country's credit card bill, the sum of all the money it has borrowed over the years. Who does the government owe this money to? A variety of creditors. It could be domestic lenders, like the country's own citizens, banks, or pension funds buying government bonds, or foreign lenders, other countries, international organizations, or global investors. For example, when you hear about government bonds, treasury bills, or IMF loans, those are all ways countries borrow money. In the US, the debt is owed partly to the public, investors, funds, individuals, and partly to other government accounts. In other countries, a lot of debt might be owed to foreign creditors or banks. The key point is that one person's debt is another's asset. If the government has an IOU, someone else is holding that IOU expecting to be repaid with interest. How do countries borrow money? Countries borrow money in a few main ways, most commonly by issuing government bonds. A bond is basically a promise. The government says, buy our bond today, and we'll pay you back later with interest. Investors lend money by purchasing these bonds. This can range from treasury bonds that mature in years to short-term bills, all forms of IOUs. Governments auction off these bonds, and they're bought by everyone from big financial institutions to regular people, through retirement funds, etc. Other forms of borrowing include taking loans from international institutions, like the IMF or World Bank, or from other countries. For instance, one country might loan money to another in a crisis, or a central bank might purchase bonds, as happened in quantitative easing. No matter the method, borrowing builds up debt that the country is obliged to repay. Why do investors lend to countries? Because they generally trust they'll get paid back. Governments usually have the power to tax, and a whole economy backing them up. Plus, many government bonds are seen as safe investments. The phrase risk-free rate often refers to US Treasury bonds. However, that trust can vanish if investors think the country might not pay up. And that brings us to the crux. What if the government doesn't pay up? Can it simply cancel its debt? Let's explore that. Why not just cancel the debt? It's theoretically possible for a sovereign nation to refuse to pay its debt. This is called a sovereign default. Basically, the country saying, we won't fulfill our debt obligations. Since a country is sovereign, there's no world police to force it to pay. Sounds tempting, right? Just cancel the debt and be done with it. But hold on, defaulting on debt is a huge deal with nasty consequences. When a country cancels its debt unilaterally, what it really means is breaking the promise to repay lenders. Think about personal finance. If you tell your bank you won't pay your loan, your credit score plunges, and you'll have a hard time borrowing money again. Similarly, countries have credit ratings. The moment a nation defaults, credit rating agencies slam its rating down to junk or default status. Lenders lose trust and might refuse to lend anymore or demand sky-high interest rates. In other words, the country might save money in the short term by not paying, but it risks cutting itself off from future financing. Another issue, remember that someone holds that debt. Canceling debt equals making your lenders take a loss. Those lenders could be your own citizens and banks. Many banks, pension funds, and individuals keep their savings in government bonds. A default would make those bonds worthless, causing losses at home. It can trigger a banking crisis if domestic banks hold a lot of government debt. And if foreign investors lose money, they might take legal action, even seizing a country's assets abroad in extreme cases. In fact, after Argentina defaulted, a group of investors famously had an Argentine Navy ship seized in a foreign port to claim money. Talk about drama. In short, canceling debt isn't like erasing a whiteboard, it's more like setting off a financial bomb. To drive this home, let's look at some real-world examples of what happens when countries default or try to wipe out debt. When countries have canceled their debt, i.e. defaulted, the aftermath is usually painful. Here are a few notable examples. Argentina, 2001. Argentina faced a massive economic crisis and defaulted on about $95 billion of debt, the largest sovereign default in history up to that point. The government simply couldn't pay its creditors. The result? A financial collapse. The economy shrank sharply. The currency peso plunged, and millions fell into poverty. Argentina was cut off from international credit markets for over a decade as lenders lost trust. It took years of negotiations and debt restructuring deals in 2005 and 2010 to settle with bondholders, and some holdouts fought in court for even longer. The default's shock was so bad that Argentina saw massive protests and political chaos. It went through 5 presidents in about 2 weeks during the 2001 crisis. Greece, 2010s. In the early 2010s, Greece's debt ballooned and it could no longer pay its bills, sparking the Eurozone debt crisis. Greece didn't outright cancel all its debt, but in 2012 it undertook the largest debt restructuring ever. Private investors took a 75% loss haircut in net present value, amounting to debt relief of about 100 billion euros, around 50–60% of Greece's GDP. Even with massive bailouts from the EU and IMF, Greece's economy went into a deep recession. GDP fell over 25%, unemployment soared, and austerity measures, tax hikes, spending cuts, painfully squeezed the population. In 2015, Greece even missed a payment to the IMF, the first developed country to do so. Technically, a default on that loan. The consequence was years of economic hardship and a tarnished reputation in credit markets. Zimbabwe, 2000s. Zimbabwe provides a dramatic example of a country effectively wiping out its debt via hyperinflation. Facing economic decline and unable to borrow, the government started printing money like crazy to pay its obligations. The result was hyperinflation so extreme that by November 2008, prices were doubling daily. In fact, Zimbabwe's inflation reached an estimated 89.7 sextillion% year over year, with a peak of 79.6 billion% in a single month. Money became virtually worthless. They printed $100 trillion Zimbabwean dollar notes that couldn't even buy a bus fare. In essence, the debt denominated in local currency was erased because the currency collapsed, but this destroyed the economy. People's life savings vanished, and the country had to abandon its currency. This is what happens if you solve debt by the printing press. You cancel the real value of the debt, but at the cost of hyperinflation and economic ruin. So, can a country just cancel its debt? Technically, yes, a country can refuse to pay. But as we've seen, doing so is like trying to fix a leaky boat with a stick of dynamite. Sure, you get rid of the debt problem in one blast, but you likely sink the ship in the process. The fallout from default, crushed credit, economic crisis, inflation, and public suffering far outweighs the short-term relief of not paying. In essence, a country canceling its debt is no free lunch. It merely swaps one kind of burden for another, often worse, burden. To put it simply, canceling national debt is like burning down your house to get rid of a spider. You eliminate the debt, but devastate everything else. It's a cure that's worse than the disease. That's why nations almost never choose to cancel debt unless they're truly out of options. Instead, they look to alternatives, restructuring deals, responsible use of inflation, and good old economic growth to gradually ease the debt load. These paths aren't easy either, but they offer a way out without destroying the country's financial credibility. In the grand scheme, national debt is about trust. A country's ability to borrow relies on the belief that it will honor its promises. Once that trust is broken, the consequences can haunt the nation for years or decades. Debt isn't just a number on a balance sheet. It's a web of promises that, if broken, can unravel an economy. Managing debt is tough, but defaulting recklessly is far tougher on a country in the long run. It's better to work through debt problems carefully than to nuke the debt and deal with the fallout. And with that being said, our cash blob waves goodbye. Thanks for watching and stay financially savvy.